From the University of California's California-China Climate Institute, this is Climate Dialogues with Jerry Brown. In Episode 8, Institute Chair Jerry Brown interviews leading climate scientist Dr. Michael Mann. The pair discuss the latest climate science, including the new Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the need to tackle short-lived climate pollutants, and Mann's new book, The New Climate War. Listen to their conversation now.
Wonderful to be in conversation with you again. And I noticed behind you, you have your book, The New Climate War, which you've been fighting so courageously for so long. So you might want to just say a word about the climate war before we get further into our discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Governor. It's always great to talk with you. Indeed, behind me is the cover of my recent book, The New Climate War, which is about the challenges that we face today in addressing the climate crisis as we sort of get past denial, because denial just isn't possible. It isn't tenable anymore for the forces of inaction. And I'm speaking to you, of course, you're in California. You have seen those wildfires up close. You've seen the impact of them. People understand that climate change is real and it's happening. And so the forces of inaction can no longer claim that it's not happening. So they've turned to other tactics, delay, deflection, division, you name it, to try to prevent us from moving on, because they don't care about why we remain addicted to fossil fuels. They just care that we do remain addicted to fossil fuels. And if they can't get us to deny climate change, they'll find other ways to convince us that we don't need to change our way of doing things. And that's really what the book is about. But it ends on a cautiously optimistic note, because I do think that we are in a moment now where there's real potential finally for seeing progress here. And thanks in substantial part, I would have to say, for your efforts as governor of California, helping lead the way, help demonstrating to the rest of the world that you can do it. You can grow the economy and you can address climate change at the same time. I think that message is starting to sink in.
Good. And I would also just add about your work. You were vilified, attacked by the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, by a lot of conservatives. And for a while, it didn't look that good. You were a little bit on the ropes there from a media point of view. But over time, the position of your critics has been completely undermined. So I call that progress, that what looked like a plausible attack that, oh boy, that raised a question, to now it's not there. It has no weight at all. So that's progress.
Well, thanks. It's kind of you to sort of mention that. I mean, I was under attack. It wasn't the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. It was actually Virginia. It was Ken Cuccinelli, who was a Tea Party Republican who wanted to investigate me because I was working when I was a faculty member at the University of Virginia back in the early 2000s. And I was working on the science of climate change, which he considered to be a fraud. And so he tried to use a law, a civil investigative demand, basically to subpoena all of my emails and personal records to discredit me, to try to embarrass me. And there was this pile on. But as you note, nature gets the last bat here. And here we are, a decade and a half later, the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has come out. And the hockey stick curve that we published 2 decades ago, which demonstrated how unprecedented recent warming is in at least the past millennium. And that was really the focal point of my critics, to try to discredit that graphic. Well, the new IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, is out 20 years later. And the hockey stick, unfortunately, has gotten longer and the blade has gotten sharper, because we have warmed more. We can extend the records farther back in time. And we know that the rate of warming now is unprecedented, not just in 1,000 years, but at least 2,000 years. And provisionally, the latest report concludes we may be warming now at a rate that is unprecedented in at least 100,000 years. And so that's where we are now. The science has a way of ultimately proving itself to be true. And that's what's happened here. It's the worst thing that can happen to you, in a sense, as a climate scientist, to watch your predictions coming true. But that's what's happening here.
So where we are what, about 1.1 degrees centigrade above the beginning of the fossil fuel industrial age?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it depends on precisely how you define the baseline, and there's some uncertainty there. But 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius, and that's important. Those 1/10 might sound small, but we're trying to avert crossing the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark, the 3-degree Fahrenheit warming mark, because we know many of the worst impacts will come to fruition if that happens. And so we are now working at the margins. We're at 1.2. We're trying to avoid crossing 1.5, and we're warming at about 0.2 per decade. So it's not hard to do the math. We're going to cross that threshold in a matter of a decade or two if we don't take dramatic action.
And just to put a present picture on where we are, I am now in West Colusa County, 2 hours north of San Francisco, and the air is 100 on the air quality index. It was 240 yesterday. The surrounding area is also suffering, all the way down to Sacramento, in many places. So it's unhealthy to go out and exercise. The sun looks like some kind of red ball, and the moon looked like a red-orange ball as well last night. Could not see any stars. And we learned of a study that says the COVID spread more aggressively when linked to the particles in the environment spread from forest fires. And the forest fires are still burning, and we haven't even yet got to the heart of the season, which in California is in September. So right on the ground here, our immediate experience mirrors the world, which I believe this last month or last quarter is the hottest in recorded history. So yeah, we're in serious situation. And so we might, and I think we've all heard of some of the terrible things, and there could be some unpredictable, unexpected surprises as well. So we'll leave that aside and just put it under the category. There's plenty of motivation to do something. So now with that thought we can agree on, what steps do you think are the most important that we could be taking or should be taking right now?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Dangerous climate change is here now. You're seeing it in California. A year and a half ago, I was seeing exactly, I was living the same experience that you just described. I was in Sydney for a sabbatical, and I couldn't leave my apartment because the air quality from the wildfire smoke was so bad. That was during the summer of unprecedented bushfires that blanketed the continent of Australia. So we're witnessing, the dangerous climate change. It's here. And the only question now is, how bad are we willing to let it get? And that's where that sort of feeds into your question. So what can we do to limit the damage? We've got this COP26, the 26th major climate conference, international climate negotiations taking place later this year, November, in Glasgow. And by the time we get there, we need all of the countries of the world to be willing to make binding pledges to reduce their carbon emissions dramatically. The Paris Agreement was a great start. And I happen to believe that we got the Paris Agreement in substantial part because of the diplomacy between the United States and China that happened beforehand, thanks in substantial part to your role as governor. That is where we are now. Paris was a foot in the door, but it's not enough. We've got to reduce carbon emissions by 50% within the decade globally.
Okay. All right. Now, how about, do you know what China's commitment will be when it goes to Glasgow for the Conference of the Parties? And do you know what America's will be, not just rhetorically, but
Right.
what credible commitment is America? Do you think America is going to have a credible commitment, and will China have a credible commitment, and will the two countries, given the American denunciation for certain behaviors on the part of China, will the two countries come together? It looks like they really need to achieve the goal that you're suggesting.
Well, they do, and and maybe there's still a role for you to play, given your experiences negotiating directly with the Chinese. You always ask exactly the right questions. What are the commitments? The nominal pledge from the Biden administration is that we will reduce our carbon emissions by 50% within the decade, which is what we need to do. But there is, I think, what you're alluding to, what we call the implementation gap, the gap between what politicians are willing to pledge to.
And, okay, can we really get to a 50% reduction and have among the 50 votes needed, the vice president breaking the tie, assuming we can get by a filibuster, then, but we have West Virginia, coal state, we have Montana, coal state, those two folks may not vote. So do we need Congress? Can Biden go to Glasgow and say we will credibly reduce by 50%, but we're probably not going to get the votes. I'll only get 48 votes, so don't count on the Congress. Is that a non-starter?
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I was going. You've anticipated exactly the question mark, the asterisks, the question I'm going to ask myself here, which is, that's the pledge, but to meet that pledge, Biden can't do that on executive actions alone. As you know, we need legislation. We need congressional action to codify those efforts in the form of climate policy. And in this reconciliation package, this $3.5 trillion reconciliation package, are a number of major climate items, including a clean would require utilities to get up to 80% of their up to 80% of their electricity from renewables by 2030. So, I mean, there's real stuff in there that could help the Biden administration make good on that pledge, but it's got to pass Congress. And you're exactly right. That reconciliation package will have to pass with 50 votes and the tie-breaking vote of the vice president. And there are at least one or two question marks there with Manchin from West Virginia.
If it doesn't pass, that'll be an indicator that America is not going to meet its obligation.
Well, it's going to mean that we can't meet our obligation over the next 2 years. But remember, there will be a midterm election where if people come out and people understand that this is a crisis now, if voters turn out and they vote on climate, they keep this in mind, they turn out, Democrats turn out in the midterm election. They turn out in large numbers, and young voters in particular, and voters of color. If that coalition turns out in this midterm election, then we can get the sorts of majorities in Congress that are necessary to pass meaningful climate legislation. But it's on a knife edge right now.
And we might not. And California is going through a recall, and the leading candidate, if the recall goes through, says the climate change is a hoax. So we're back to that again. We have a mini Trump or a maxi Trump running here. So hopefully we're going to stop that. Now, let me ask you another question. So we've got to get these aggressive carbon reduction plans. All right. CO2 reduction. What about going after the super pollutants? Some scientists say that we could buy ourselves more time if we could dramatically reduce methane emissions, soot, carbon emissions, chlorofluorocarbons, and other of the super pollutants that are shorter lived but are more powerful in their heat trapping capacity. What do you have to say about that?
No, you're exactly right. And it's always the same sort of quandary, right? Yes, that can help certainly on the time frame in question. If we're talking about the next decade or two, and we're worried about crossing key warming thresholds and triggering potential tipping point like responses, then we want to use every tool we've got to avoid crossing those thresholds within the next decade or two. And these shorter lived contributors, methane, soot, black carbon, that can play a major role. At the same time, we can't allow a focus on those pollutants to be used as a crutch for carbon polluters to continue to dump carbon dioxide pollution into the atmosphere, because that's there for the long term. Once that's there, much of it is around for more than 1,000 years. So we can't lose focus of the carbon dioxide, but at the same time, we do need to tackle methane and some of these other greenhouse gases. We need a comprehensive strategy.
And the question, I don't know the answer of how hard that is. California took very serious action to reduce methane and soot.
Yeah.
How effective that'll be, only time will tell. Because in politics, there's always votes. There's always the next legislative session or the next candidacy, the next election. So that is up in the air. But we certainly know, here's a dilemma that I'd like to get your reaction on. If we do what you suggested, we really credibly present a plan that will reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. And we get China to do that. I don't know where India and Russia are going to be. We got to get them in there too,
Yeah.
and Brazil. Okay, we get that. Now, as we crank down on carbon emissions, oil drilling, coal drilling, fossil fuel cars and trucks, and all the rest. Okay, at the same time, because there's so much CO2 and greenhouse gases, there's so much, and it's going up at 40 billion tons a year. Even we cut it back to 35 and then 33 and then 28, things are going to get worse than they are. And right now they're very bad. So here's the dilemma I see. Every year, from a climate point of view, things have to get worse, and they will get worse for many, many years. But at the same time that we have to spend all this money on adaptation, fighting forest fires, much more, billions, tens of billions more. We got to deal with sea level hurricanes and floods in New York, all the rest, Miami, Louisiana. Okay, we got to do all that. And then at the same time, we have to do all these tough measures to reduce greenhouse gases. So we got to be working with both hands, get adapting, which costs billions, trillions, and we got to mitigate by reducing the emissions in the first place. Tell me, doesn't that sound like a pretty tall order?
Well, it does, Governor. And, it sounds like we need a major mobilization of all the resources that we have. And we've done it before, as you know. We did it in World War II. We did it with the Apollo project. When we have been faced with crises or, defining challenges, one of the things that I love about this country that we live in is we've risen to the challenge in the past. And I like to think that we still have the capability of doing that. And I like to think that the rest of the world, despite, what happened over the last 4 years, the last administration, I think there's still a reservoir of goodwill and respect around the rest of the world. And if we take leadership, if we take real leadership, I think that can be infectious. So you're right. This is a monumental challenge. But, when have we ever declined such a challenge?
No, I think that's great. I think we can meet it, but I want to be very clear about the challenge. So let's suppose we get to 50%. That means our CO2 won't be 40 billion tons a year. It'll be 20 billion tons a year. And then we got those other super pollutants, and they're another 5 or 10 billion tons. So that's what we're going to emit in 2030. And reducing, but still significant emissions in 2031, 32, 33. The weather has got to get worse. In my little neighborhood here, it's going to get more forest fires, more drought, more lack of moisture. So what we're saying is you must sacrifice, we must pay more, we must do more, and things will get worse for the next 10, 15, maybe 20 years. Oh, but by the way, in 20 years, they're going to get better. And by the way, if we don't do anything, they'll get a hell of a lot worse.
Yeah.
That's my message.
Right.
Is that a kind of hard message to deliver?
Well, it depends on how you deliver the message. As Governor, a very not just a successful policymaker and governor, but somebody who understands politics. It's all in how you deliver the message. And one of there are things that are sort of empowering about the latest science, believe it or not. with all of the, the negative consequences that we're seeing, and the science is now telling us that this is due to climate change. The IPCC report, this latest report, did what no other report before it was willing to do, and connect the dots and say, yes, these unprecedented extreme weather events that we are seeing are caused by climate change. Catastrophic climate change, by some measure, has arrived. You see that in California. That's the bad news that the science has delivered. But the good news, just to let me, very quickly, the good news, the more comprehensive modeling that we now do, which incorporates the carbon cycle. So we allow the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere, as we call it, to absorb carbon, which they do in the real world. The models now account for that. And what we find is that when we stop emitting carbon, when we reach net zero emissions, the warming stops within a couple years, 2 to 3 years. So there is a direct and immediate response to our efforts to lower carbon emissions. That's the good news. Things stop getting worse in large part when we stop.
Wait a minute, did I hear you right? When we get to net carbon zero?
Yeah.
Well, that's like 2040.
Well, so let's say, that's 2040, 2050.
2040.
So
I'll be 108. And I tell you, when I am 108 and still breathing and cogitating, then things will start getting better. But before then, they're going to keep getting worse.
Well, you can do the math differently. The same math, the same physics, but let me frame it a little bit differently. If we reduce carbon emissions by 50% within the next 10 years, and we reach that net zero by mid-century 2050, then in all likelihood, we keep the warming of the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is still possible, but it requires immediate and dramatic action.
Right. So that's the point. I don't quite know how that works, because there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere that it's trapping all those gases. And we're not talking about getting zero now, we're talking about in 2050. So between now and 2050, that's a lot more heat trapping gases to trap heat. So tell me how that all gets better. You got to explain that to this, because I don't understand it.
So what happens, we're still adding carbon pollution, and we will be, just 50% less by 2030 in that scenario. And it takes all the way to 2050 for those emissions to go to zero. That means the planet continues to warm up. But as we ramp down those emissions pretty dramatically, 50% from the peak by 2030, all the way down to zero by 2050, as we ramp those emissions down, the warming starts to plateau. So it's still continuing, but it's sort of reaching an asymptotic level. And that level can be under 1.5 degrees Celsius if we do that.
Okay,
if we
that's the
reduce
big
those.
point. Whether there's more heat trapping gas or not, you're saying as a conclusion, we can stay under the world can stay under 1.5 in general. That doesn't mean that the Arctic might not be a lot warmer or California a lot drier. We're going to have our regional differences, but in aggregate, we can stay under 1.5. That'll be pretty good. That'll be
and if we do that, then when you look at the regional consequences, in aggregate, they are within our adaptive capacity at that point. It's when we start going beyond 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius, 4, 5, 6 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet. That's where, in most sober assessments, we start to exceed our adaptive capacity, which is just a fancy way of saying, we're up the creek without a paddle if we do that.
Yeah, well, that should scare the hell out of us. Let me throw you a different curveball here. I had an occasion to speak to one of the authors of The Limits to Growth, a Norwegian scientist who was right there in 1972. And we spoke about carrying capacity, the human footprint, overshoot. That all conjures up, describes a situation where we have to live within limits, and but we don't hear that limit talk, that because that got so trashed. They said, well, we got a lot of oil, we got a lot of coal, and all that stuff.
Yeah,
it appears that scientifically there is a carrying capacity if we want a certain amenable quality of life. So could you comment on how we, if you want to, or you do think it's accurate, how do you talk about carrying capacity or overshoot? Because if you say we could overshoot, then you say there's some limit, some boundary within which we should be living.
Yeah, so this is a whole new sort of emerging field in sort of global ecology, planetary limits, planetary boundaries. And there are multiple boundaries. There's a climate change, and an amount of climate change, if we go beyond that, then we exceed our capacity, our adaptive capacity. But overfishing, air pollution, deforestation, there are all of these boundaries. We've just been talking about one of them, which is the climate boundary, but we are fighting a war, if you will, on multiple fronts at the same time. And each of those fronts challenges our sustainability as a civilization on this planet. So, there is no question. We cannot continue on this trajectory of resource exploitation, using up all of the natural resources of the planet, and continue to meet the needs of 8 billion and growing people on a finite planet with perhaps less food and less water and less space because of climate change and these other environmental challenges. It's a monumental task. And, there is this emerging discussion, I'm sure you've heard degrowth, this idea that, by placing an emphasis on maximizing, gross domestic product in the United States and globally, that sort of prioritization, this idea of infinite economic growth, at least to the extent that it is built on the use of finite resources, is not sustainable. It is inconsistent with a sustainable existence of human civilization on this planet. So there's a larger conversation that we need to have about this trajectory that we're on. I've at times thought that the pandemic maybe was, a window into that, an opportunity for us to think about how fragile our existence on this planet really is, far more fragile than we often realize. That's the larger conversation that has to happen. And we need to, think seriously about whether, a market-driven global economy is consistent with a sustainable existence on this planet. That's the ultimate conversation we have to have. My argument has been, we've got to address the climate crisis massively within the next 10 years. And that means working within the system that exists. We're not going to overthrow capitalism, in my view. We're not going to see that happen over the next 10 years. We're not going to see us move away from market economics within the next 10 years. And that's the time frame on which we have to reduce these carbon emissions. So we have to work within the system that exists, as you did as governor,
Right.
to change it.
But in that system, we do put political constraints. And many folk at the Wall Street Journal and the Republican Party and elsewhere don't like the idea of a political constraint on the workings of the market. But it's very clear that we must impose restrictions. Now, we do have examples. We have China with their Communist Party, authoritarian, top-down. This is the way it is. Okay, that's what we call an extreme version. But we have our own version. In California, we said the utilities must have 60% renewable sources for their electricity by 2030. That's a law. That's coercion. You do it, or we're going to take money from you. We're not going to send the police to your house at midnight, but we're going to tell PG&E and Southern California Edison, we're going to take money from you, and your shareholders are going to lose. So they do follow. But we're going to have to do the same thing on cars. How often, even California, the vaunted California environmental state, didn't pass a law that said by a certain date, by a date certain in the future, you can't sell fossil fuel trucks that take gas or diesel. Well, we got to do that.
And that's motivating the automobile industry, though, to move in that direction. And so it feeds back on itself.
In many respects, we are more dependent on business enlightenment than political enlightenment. There's a drag here on the part of the politicians. So,
I think that's right.
It's going to have to come from the business people, the insurers, the bankers, and then, of
Finance,
course,
the finance world. Yep.
the bankers, yeah, and then hopefully maybe the religious world, maybe the evangelicals will get the drift here. The
Absolutely.
universities
Yep.
have to be a big promoter of this. The think tanks. So it's going to take Greta. Greta has a op-ed in the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And where she's calling us out. So it's going to take a lot of people, not just California or
That's right.
Washington, many sources. And it's going to take our fraught relation with China. Right now, generally, Xi's doing a lot of stuff and we don't like it. And we feel it's very important to denounce him. And then after we finish denouncing, we say, but let's have very close collaboration on climate. So that is going to be very hard to work that to try to reform his internal behavior and at the same time get external collaboration. But we're going to find a way. It's going to be messy, but it's a very exciting period. And I want to say I'm glad that you're able to utter some optimistic thoughts here in the midst of a very formidable challenge, because it is formidable. And on the one hand, we don't want to minimize. We don't want to tell people, it's all going to be nice. No, it's a hell of a challenge, but we can do it. We can stay under 1.5, but not on the course we are now. We're going to have to do more. And part of the discussion here is to disseminate thoughts that will motivate us to take the action. And when I say we, unfortunately, it's not you and me. It's the government. It's Biden. It's the Republicans in Congress. It's oil and gas and coal. We're all going to have to get in this. And that is really the challenge. How do we go about that? And you've got your war there. And yeah, it's a war it's not a war. We're not going to shoot people, but we're going to get very excited and we have to get very fervent or we're not going to be able to overcome the inertia.
No, absolutely. And I should say, some of my optimism here derives from, your leadership, what you were able to accomplish in California. You were a beacon when the rest of the country was under, the authority of the previous president. And he was going back on our prior commitments. But California was leading the way. That led other states. Pennsylvania decided to join RGGI. We chose to join a regional consortium like what you have on the West Coast. So even during that very dark 4-year period, there was some progress being made. Now that we have the political winds a little bit at our back, this is our time. This is when we have to move forward.
Yeah, we got to move forward. And if we stumble because of an election or two, we got to keep going because the climate threat doesn't go away.
That's right.
So it doesn't, we can lose an election, you lose 2 elections, but we got to keep on the case and hopefully we'll win those elections. But whatever, we have to keep on the cause. We got to win the big fight, which is reducing carbon and the other pollutants that are heating up our planet. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
Amen.
For your work. Keep up the good fight. We'll continue out here in California as well.
Thanks so much, Governor. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, my friend.
Me too. Thank you.